The Toy Box Killer and his transcripts. If I remember correctly, he had accomplices, people who were aware. That's seriously fucked up on so many levels. Holy shit. The story of Mary Vincent always stands out to me. In 1978, 15-year-old Mary was hitchhiking. A man named Lawrence Singleton picked her up. He brutally raped her, and eventually made her get out of the car. She planned to run, but he noticed, and cut both her arms off. He threw her into a ditch, ravine and left her to die. She packed her stumps with mud to stop the bleeding and spent all night crawling out. She eventually makes it to the highway and starts walking, naked and covered in blood. The first car that saw her sped away in fear. The second car was a couple on their honeymoon. They picked her up and she survived. Edited to add, I was in a rush when I wrote this, so you should definitely read more into the story, it's crazy. From the horrific act itself, to the court proceedings, to the fact that he hardly served any time. That a disobedient colonel from the former USSR was the sole reason World War III did not break out and ruined the planet for people in 1983. My brother's ex-GF had 2 older sisters. They died before she was born. That really sucks. When I was a kid there were a lot of PSA-type things about kids not playing in abandoned refrigerators for that reason.
I remember this poor kid who went missing while I was at Purdue.
My mum didn't tell me this story for the longest time, I think just so she wouldn't unnecessarily worry me when I was younger. But my parents split up when I was about 4 years old and my mum and my sisters stayed in a small town house for a few years before moving in with my stepdad. Anyway, while we were at the town house for I think less than a year, my mum heard something in her room in the middle of the night and when she woke up to go look there was a man in her room. She audibly gasped and got out of bed either to fight or run to our room. She couldn't really decide cause she was pumped full of adrenaline. The guy ended up running out of our back door and when the police came they found signs of forced entry. She never told any of us the full story cause we were still sound asleep the entire time, but she ended up explaining more of it the older we got. A guy I worked with was riding his dirt bike through the woods and somebody hung a cable between 2 trees. My buddy caught his throat on it and saw the dude steal his dirt bike. Woke up in the hospital with a lacerated throat and a broken larynx. Pretty crazy what somebody will do for something so cheap. Dude is lucky he didn't get decapitated. Tough to pick just one because there is true evil in humanity out there. Stuff like the Blood Eagle ritual is pretty awful. I still don't get why the hell they couldn't have gotten to him in time. His parents have filed a lawsuit over this, because honestly, there's no reason that child should have died as long as he was on that phone with 911. I don't regret many things in my life. But I regret this one deeply.
During World War II, an American airplane crashed near the Japanese island of Chichijima. There were 9 servicemen on board. One was rescued by an American submarine. The other 8 were taken in by the Japanese. Don't want to go into all the details, but through some time and events, the Japanese ended up eating those servicemen. But that's not the weird part. The Japanese ended up eating those servicemen. But that's not the weird part. It happened to my mom's friend a couple of years back.
My friend's boss bought an Audi A4 convertible, back when they were new and interesting. One of the talking points was the pop-up roll hoops that were hidden unless you rolled it. That would be so fucking traumatic for the other driver. Fairly common to break your neck and not realize apparently.
Have you heard of the Nazi so bad that other Nazis, in particular fellow SS Nazis, constantly tried to get him and his unit disbanded and arrested? No. Well, his name was Oskar Dirlewanger, and his unit was nicknamed the Black Hunters or the Dirlewanger Brigade. From an article, "Holy shit, fuck that guy."
Years ago my now husband worked for an industrial laundry company in their head office when a PR disaster happened that also mentally screwed up a number of people. I had to dig through my hospital's biohazard trash because a nurse had thrown out a fetus. Holy shit. Also on first reading I thought the baby screamed and was still alive.
I used to run the boilers in a dough building. Apparently at some point in the 80s, 3 people were murdered over involvement in a big VCR theft. VCRs meant for the school system had apparently been stolen out of this warehouse. It was an inside job. Something went wrong. The head custodian was found shot to death, and later the bodies of the other 2 were reported buried in Monticello, but word is, they had first been incinerated.
A colleague of my dad's went on holiday to a small cottage in Wales in the middle of nowhere in the UK's winter time with his wife. They were found by the owner of the house after the week they rented it for was up, completely insane, clawing at their skin, and the whole place was a wreck. The full story was never found out, but the guy and his wife both were rambling about a red knife that followed them wherever they went that they found in the bed of the cottage. They are both still alive and, as far as I'm aware, under psychiatric care. What kind of yellow wallpaper shit is this?
This is from South Africa. The woman is called Alison Botha and she was abducted, raped and then choked until she blacked out. She was driven into a secluded area, stabbed 30 times in the abdomen and 16 times in the throat and left for dead on the side of the road.
Told this here before, but once more. Yikes. What relief for that man to know he wasn't going crazy though.
A woman named Joyce Vincent died alone in her bedsit apartment in London and wasn't found for 2 years. She was only discovered because bailiffs came to evict her from the property and instead found her decomposed body in half-skeleton form. The TV had been on, and the windows had been open, for 2 years. Despite the smell and the noise emanating from the apartment, no one had come sooner and found her. Her friends were mentioned in the story, so if they were here friends, why did they not check up on her in those 2 years?
Japanese war crimes in WW2. Role models. My great-uncle was captured by the Japanese. He never really talked about it, except for one night when he had a drink and told my dad and granddad that they'd just decapitate people all the time. That's about all he ever said on the subject, but it clearly deeply affected him for the rest of his life.
https://www.cbc. CA, News, Canada, British Columbia, lack of oxygen killed 4 at BC mine report 1. 582,325. My BF works in a coal mine and told me that there are places where taking a shit can kill you. Like in the story above, the oxygen level at head height is fine, but there's carbon monoxide closer to the ground. You squat to take a shit and die. Edit, actually it's carbon dioxide not monoxide, thank you for telling me. Sorry for the confusion.
In 3rd grade a guy came to our school and held our class hostage. He had already killed his wife and was there to kill his kid. The administrators convinced him the kid was not there and to take one of their cars and leave. After threatening to kill us multiple times, tying up the gym teacher, and dragging someone's grandma around with a knife at her neck, he finally left about 30 minutes later.
Before my dad died, he once told me a story from when he was in Vietnam in the 1960s. He told me about a mission where he and one other American with 5 CIDG strikers, South Vietnamese villagers turned fighters, were tasked to emplace seismic ground sensors along a trail network deep in the jungle. He said they were about 2 days into the mission when he and 2 of the strikers split off from the main group to go watch a nearby trail intersection. He said the jungle was pretty quiet that day, just the sounds of birds and bugs and an occasional monkey. He said they had been watching the trail intersection for about 3 or 4 hours and were deciding on whether to move further down the trail or to turn back and link up with the rest of the patrol. Before leaving the cover of the brush, my dad said he checked the trail ahead of them one last time and prepared his men to move. Now here is where the story gets interesting, and he told this part with absolute dead seriousness. He said just as he started to step out onto the trail he sees a light-skinned black Union cavalry soldier in full battle gear laying alongside the trail just shy of the intersection. My dad said the Union soldier had 2 pistols, a Spencer rifle and a short curved club at his hip. As my dad was trying to process what he was seeing, the soldier looked directly at him and smiled. Then the soldier slowly placed a finger up to his lips as if to tell him to be silent and then motioned my dad back off the trail. My dad said he signaled for his men to remain hidden, and he recalled that as he slipped back into the jungle on one side of the trail, the Union soldier did the same on his side of the trail. Less than 10 seconds later he said the lead element of a group of NVA North Vietnamese Army soldiers walked right through the trail intersection some 30 feet away. My dad estimated that the group was comprised of some 70 to 80 soldiers equipped with automatic rifles, light machine guns and rocket-propelled grenade launchers. He has no doubt that his entire team would have been wiped out on the spot. He said as soon as the enemy soldiers had passed, he and his team beat feet out of there as fast and as quietly as they could and rejoined with the rest of the patrol. He reported the enemy soldiers his team had encountered, but decided not to say anything about the soldier he had seen. My dad kept this secret for many years, only telling me just before he passed and earlier only telling his grandmother on her deathbed in the 1970s. He said when he told his grandmother, she smiled and without opening her eyes told him, "You saw old Red Tom. Red Tom was my great-great-grandfather. He was a half-black, half-Creek free man who was a scout for the Union Army during the Civil War and later served with the U.S. Cavalry in the American West. He was known for carrying 2 pistols, a Spencer rifle and a Creek war club into battle. That is one of the most interesting, as opposed to horrifying, stories I've seen in this thread. Thank you for sharing. In a thread that's full of so much darkness, this story really is the light that shines brightly. Love this. And how sweet for your grandma to hear about her grandpa watching over her son on her deathbed. Heart."
Nishabur train disaster is something that reminds me how death can come at any moment. I feel like this was intentional, not an accident. Why were so many extremely explosive and flammable materials stored together? How did the train travel 20 kilometers on its own without anyone noticing? And most importantly, how did it gain 50 meters in elevation over that distance? Amateur rugby. Guy gets hit pretty hard and dislocates his hip. While waiting for the ambulance, a guy runs up saying he's a physio and can at least relocate the joint.
This is a hometown story that stayed with me. It happened literally right around the corner from where I grew up, maybe a 2-minute drive away. How do people do shit like that? This sounds exactly like the story of There's Something Wrong with Aunt Diane, another real-life event where a woman drove a van full of children down the wrong way while being high on some drug before eventually hitting another car and killing herself and the kids.
H. Holmes and the hotel he built specifically to murder people. Like something from a horror movie but completely true. https://n, Wikipedia. Org, wiki, h%2e_h%2e_Holmes, WPROV=SFTI1. There was a good sci-fi time travel series called Timeless which featured an episode where the main characters go back in time to the World's Fair in Chicago, and they wind up trapped in Holmes' murder hotel.
The murders of Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom. A girl I went to high school with. Her parents and her little brother left for the weekend to go on some trip, but she had softball practice and couldn't go. She was home alone sleeping in her bed in a completely dark room. She's startled awake by the loud sound of her bedroom window breaking. She watches as a dark figure slowly crawls into her room through the window. Let's not meet. That there's a guy casing the bar that I work at literally right now, and I can't do anything to stop him. I hope you took a picture of him.
My long-term partner decided to end his life suddenly and unexpectedly a few years ago. He was the happiest person I knew, and even with 20/20 hindsight, videos, pouring through old messages etc., I wouldn't be able to identify any warning signs. My sister just did the same on the 7th of September 19. No one had any idea. It's completely baffling. It's shaken me to the core.
This one terrifies me. I'm going to be purposely kinda vague about this since I'm figuring the events in this story are rare. The stories told in the comments have now made me realize this happens fairly often, and that's very tragic. Closing parenthesis.
A family friend was cleaning her bus before the bus run. She had 2 small kids who were strapped into car seats in the bus. She swept the floor and was standing outside the bus leaning in, using a dustpan and brush to collect the dirt she had swept up. The auto doors on the bus kicked in and closed on her neck. She suffocated while her 2 young children looked on, unable to do anything because they couldn't undo their car seat buckles. I wonder what kind of bus this was. Every bus I can think of, the doors move pretty easily with force. I was in a crappy motel, the room had bedbugs. I was too exhausted to go to the front desk. I just needed to make it until the morning. I slept in the tub. Hours later I hear someone breaking through the window. I had a big knife with me and ran out into the room to find a man halfway through my window. We stared for a while at each other in shock. I think we both were scared. Then he says, "Is this your room?" I'm like, "Yes, this is my room, man." More staring, then he slowly starts backing out while cursing me for leaving my window unlocked and not expecting him to break in a thread full of stories making me question why I'm even here. Yours has some comical value at least.
Well, this one was quite dreadful for me at least. The murder of James Bulger.
Alright, so my preschool teacher, who also ended up somehow changing jobs and becoming my 11th grade English teacher, had a super interesting life. Her mother had some super famous book, her father worked high up in the government, but enough about her family. First, let me describe her to you. She had dark hair and blue eyes. You'll see why this matters in a minute. She told this story every single year to the new students in her class. When she was younger, she was driving through Arizona on a 2-way road while her boyfriend at the time was following behind her on his motorcycle. For those who don't live in Arizona, certain stretches of it can be quite isolated and deserted. She said that they were on a long drive. It's been about 6 years since I was in her class, so details are fuzzy, but basically her and her boyfriend both knew the destination where they were heading by memory and eventually got separated by a few miles. A man who was behind her in a Volkswagen Beetle kept pulling up beside her into the other lane, no one was coming, and motioning at her to pull over. She somewhat ignored him the first few times, but he kept doing it and began getting more frantic each time. She said that she believed that he spotted something wrong with her car, so she saw a parking lot off the road for a deserted gas station and pulled over. Once pulled over, she said that she instantly got an eerie feeling. The man was suspicious and kept telling her that he saw something wrong with her headlight and insisted she get out of the car so he could show her what he meant. Her boyfriend, who was a few miles behind her, eventually caught up and spotted her car at the sketchy gas station. Right as she was out of the car, her boyfriend began to pull in. As he did that, this man got into his car and sped off like his life depended on it.
The 1904 Cincinnati Privy disaster. In 1904, 9 schoolgirls drowned in an outhouse after the floor collapsed. They literally drowned in human waste. This is the second post in this thread that features Cincinnati. For such an inconspicuous little Midwestern city, it does have a colorful history.
One of my friends had someone following her home, hiding in the bushes so they couldn't be seen. She booked it to her house, got inside, and he was watching the house from the outside. She called the cops. They come along quietly and got the jump on him. He had condoms, handcuffs, and a knife. When they got his DNA, it turned out that he was linked to a half-dozen rapes in the area. She credits her regimen of running sprints to outrunning him that night and firmly believes she would have been raped if she couldn't outrun him then. Rule number 1: cardio.
2 off-duty U.S. soldiers were on a train in France. When walking past a toilet, they recognized the loading noises of rifles coming from inside. They waited outside and jumped the guy when he came out. He was a terrorist who was about to go through the train killing people. 3. It's the spring of 2001. I was just ending my shift at a major hospital in New York. I headed back to my apartment, entertained my daughter with random conversation for a while, had a meal, and was chilling out. Business as usual. Later that night, my mother came by and took me back to the very same hospital where I worked. We were conversing in the car, and nothing seemed out of sorts at all. She never mentioned where we were headed, and I had no idea of the destination until we actually arrived. When we arrived at the hospital, I kept getting questioned about who I was, including who I really was, where I grew up, who my daughter was, where I lived, and more. Battery after battery of third degree, coming out of absolutely nowhere. I had no clue what was going on or why anyone was interrogating me this way. Fast forward to about 3 days later or so, I find myself sitting in a chair, calmly looking out at a lovely view from my apartment window, except this wasn't my apartment. In a quiet panic, I took stock of my surroundings and realized I was at the end of a hallway, and I'd been here before. It was the hospital where I worked, but it wasn't in New York. It was Portland, and it was the psych floor. In an instant, I had no idea why I was there, what day or time it was, nor what had gone on since my last shift on the floors beneath. It turns out that I was, indeed, working a regular shift several days prior. The story is that I walked off the job with no warning nor explanation, went to my mother's place, and was rambling on about what I needed to do in the city the next day. She took me to the where I reported living in NYC, complete with some bogus address and phone number, with my daughter. I was claiming that my little sister was my daughter. They admitted me, and I didn't break back into generally accepted reality for several days. When I came to, as described above, I had absolutely no idea what had happened, why I was locked up again, nor any memory whatsoever of what I'd said or done after that instant walking off of my shift. Statistically, probably no one reading this has been blessed with the misfortune of dissociative fugue. Sitting in that chair by the window at the end of a hospital hallway, when literally 1 instant earlier I'd been casually going about my job, felt just as disorienting and jarring as you'd imagine. I know this isn't a serial killer or drunk driver story, but it's absolutely true, and it's the single most terrifying event of my life. I wouldn't wish that instant reality shift sensation on my very worst enemy. Psychosis is a hell of a drug, edit. Silver and gold? You guys. I might be the world's worst at accepting compliments, but I thank every one of you for your kindness, your understanding, and for sharing your own stories. After a long and inwardly violent road through psychotic hell, I'm finding comfort in this outpouring and the sense that I may not be as isolated as I've long thought. Thank you all for that. This same thing literally happened to my mom when I was 15. She drove her car off a cliff, hiked a mountain and was found on the side of the road with no memory of any part of her life but swore up and down that her name was Moody_Cutie, her daughter's actual name. She lost her total memory for 3 months and then one day in the shower it all came rushing back.
My dad and some friends got drunk and went for a drive on some back roads and were going as fast as the truck would go as teenagers. My dad was slightly less drunk than the others and eventually demanded they let him get out. They pulled over and he and one other girl got out. He and the girl started walking to town while the other 3 sped off in the opposite direction.
Nutty Putty Cave in Utah was sealed up in 2009 after John Jones was trapped upside down in a small crevice while spelunking. When rescue teams finally arrived he had been upside down for so long that his legs were drained of blood. Didn't they almost get him out, but then one of the pulleys snapped and he got trapped even worse. That's my personal nightmare.
In the late 1950s the Soviet Union spearheaded a campaign to convince the World Health Organization that smallpox could be eradicated. Smallpox is a highly contagious disease that is specific to humans. Insofar as we know, no other species on Earth can get or carry smallpox. That's some next-level Resident Evil crap and is as fascinating as it is horrifying. Thank you for sharing.
A female friend in college disappeared from a party at another university in the city town 25-ish miles north of our school. She had arrived with another friend who I believe had driven. At some point she split off to play cornhole or something and was later inexplicably gone. Phone calls went to voicemail, police were called, but she was simply missing.
I work at a max security prison and we have several inmates who are severely mentally ill. The ones that self-harm wear a Fitbit kind of thing to monitor heart rate. If there is a change, we rush their room to stop whatever is happening. On top of this, we also do visual inspections. On one round, a co-worker was doing cell checks and noticed this particular inmate had blood on their face, but nothing came up on the monitors or anything. So he called to the inmates to ask if they were okay. The inmate had their eyes closed and just kept repeating, "It doesn't hurt." The inmate would not answer where the blood was from. We opened the cell to see what the situation was, and it turns out the inmate had plucked out both of their eyes and they were laying on the floor. The inmate's HR monitor never alerted and the inmate never screamed. Paramedics said the inmate's vitals were normal and the inmate was fully responsive.
From when I was delivering pizza, holy fuck, do you still go into people's houses? Or do you just stand outside now? The Lake Nyos disaster. The lake periodically belches a cloud of invisible carbon dioxide gas that suffocates everything within a 16-mile radius. In 1986, over 1,700 people and all their livestock died without even understanding what was happening to them. My science teacher in high school was in the Peace Corps and one of the first people to come across this village after it happened. He said it was so eerie because all the flies and mosquitoes had died and it was so silent.
When I was in 4th grade, we had buddy classes with first graders to help teach them how to write and read properly.
One night about 2 years ago, I believe it was spring and it was about 9 or 10 at night. A bit of context: my mother is a photographer and she has one of those big expensive cameras. Now I was just sitting in my room playing Xbox with my buddies and I heard the commotion of my family in the doorway to the backyard, the kind of commotion of people gawking, so I went out to see what it was all about. I go to my dad and ask what it is and he says there's something in our backyard and my mum is out there trying to get pictures but her flash isn't working, and she's right at the fence trying to get pictures, and all of a sudden the flash goes off and lights up the pitch black yard, and right in front of my mum is a bear stood up on its back legs just standing there. By the time the flash was done, my mum was nearly in the house. On September 20, 1987, in Bellingham, Washington, a Georgia-Pacific paper mill worker was sent to inspect a heat exchanger system in the steam plant. Inside the base of the stack, he spotted a charred skeleton. To this day, no one is certain who the victim was, how they wound up in such a horrible place, nor why. Local paper, https://www. Bellingham Herald. Com. News, local, article 173,627,656, HTML, good YouTube video on the subject, https://www. YouTube.com, watch, time _continue = 1 and v = bhvgm2nu3u. You know shit is real serious if the sentence starts with the complete date.
My cuckoo clock, that is broken for more than 20 years, made weird sounds 2 times in a row in the middle of the night. My brother's Furby was reactivated after about 10 years when my grandparents jostled the cabinet where it was stored. We screamed our heads off when we opened the door.
On May 31, 2014, 2 12-year-old girls lured their friend into the woods and brutally stabbed her in an attempt to summon or appease Slenderman, a fictional internet villain who is said to inhabit wooded areas and stalk his victims among the trees. This one is especially stupid since none of the Slenderman mythos involves people worshipping him or sacrificing for him. He's just a creepy long dude in the woods. John List killed his whole family: wife, mother, daughter and 2 sons. He meticulously planned the whole thing, cancelling all delivery services, excusing the kids from school, and even turned the air conditioning as low as possible to preserve the bodies for as long as possible. What did the letter say that he left? The horror movie The Stepfather is based on his life. Interesting thing is that it was released a few years before List was even caught. Very good movie.
One night my son, 20 at the time, was brought home fall down drunk by his buddy James. Glad your son is okay. I just read that article. Holy shit, chills. How did your son react to it? Did he say James ever showed any signs of being out of his mind?
Happened to me, have posted about it before. I was around 11 years old and I woke up in the middle of the night to a man straddled on top of me with his hand over my mouth and nose. He told me to roll over and not scream. I rolled onto the floor and tried to scream bloody murder. I say tried cause when you are truly terrified it can take a second to find your voice. My mum heard me screaming and came in and fought with the guy. He was at least 6 feet, she was 5 feet 3 inches, and scared him enough with the fighting and screaming that he took off out the window he had come in through. Never did catch him. Hold the fuck up for a moment. What the fuck? A pub in Colnbrook, Berkshire in UK has a pretty terrifying history. I've actually eaten at that pub with my karate class when we went to the Windsor seminar. Doesn't feel weird or anything, at least it didn't when we went in.
My mum was driving, and a guy ran out in the road, so she stopped so she couldn't hit him. Probably one of the many reasons newer cars auto-lock their doors once you go over 15 miles per hour.
Carol Durant was at a shopping mall in Salt Lake City in 1974 when she was approached by a man claiming to be a police officer. He said that someone had tried to break into her car and asked her to come with him. He then said he would drive her to the police station and she got into his car.
An acquaintance of mine sent his son to triathlon camp in Texas. Naegleria is terrifying to me. You can get it just from getting water up your nose swimming in a lake, or I've heard but am too lazy to check, there have been people who got it from using a neti pot. The childhood best friend of one of my exes died this way. Maybe not of this exact amoeba, but a waterborne amoeba that ate him neurologically.
When my aunt was about 16, she was working at a grocery store and had a boss in his mid-20s. One day he called the house and was begging her to sneak out and hang out with him. She was considering it because it was her boss and she didn't want to say no. My mom, who is 2 years younger than her, always gets these incredibly spot-on gut feelings. She had one that night and begged my aunt not to go out with him. So, a 20-something man wanted a 16-year-old girl, aka a minor, who was also one of his employees, to sneak out and hang out with him? I'd say no gut feelings required for that one. Dude is a creeper. Good job that your mom warned her sister. Smart girl.
The Battle of Ossowiec Fortress 1915, German troops attempted to gas the Russian defenders out as the fort had been a thorn in the side of the Germans since the outbreak of war. The gas succeeded in killing almost 3 whole companies. The Germans then advanced across the fields, expecting the fortress to be empty and an easy victory. From within the fortress, Russian troops emerged, coughing up blood and lung fragments, covered in bandages made up as improvised gas masks as well as chemical burns. They returned rifle and light artillery fire at the advancing Germans. The German troops didn't bother firing back as they just ran back to their lines. Their commanders claimed, "They're already dead, give it 20 minutes and go take the place," to which the soldiers remarked, "It is not men protecting that place, but the devil." Ossowiec Fortress never fell during the war, as when the German troops went back months after there was already fresh defenders. I know this story is much different to the ones other people have said, but it's the one I could think of as truly terrifying. There was a woman who worked in a science lab who spilled 2 drops of organic mercury on the back of her gloved hand. Those 2 drops destroyed her entire nervous system and brain. https://www.youtube.com watch v = NJ7M01JV058.
Artemis Pyle, the drummer from Lynyrd Skynyrd, survived a plane crash and walked to a nearby house only to be shot by the homeowner. The homeowner saw a bloody long-haired man and winged him. Pyle survived that as well and made a full recovery.
My wife arrived at her parents' house that she was currently living in due to health issues of her father's. She got into the house, no one else was there at the time, and instead of going further in, stopped in the first room that held the computers, which was right by the door. She went into the room and was messing around on the internet when one of the cats came into the room. Her cat, to be precise. Holy crap, I have a similar story.
The Donner Party, a group of American pioneers that had to resort to cannibalism to survive being stranded in the Sierra Nevada. https://n Wikipedia. Org Wiki Donner_Party. I recently did a research project on the Donner Party, Forlorn Hope, and it was intense to read about. Honestly though, the scariest part of that story is Kesberg's at the very end of the relief parties. Had a boiling pot of human flesh on the fire when the rescuers found him.
I would call it creepy more than scary, but my mum's friend had a small house and lived alone. She noticed weird things, a batch of soup depleting faster than usual, missing eggs, damp towels in the hamper when she hadn't used any, extra dishes in the dishwasher, etc. This went on for months. She thought she was just being forgetful. One day she heard some thumping around in her attic and went to investigate. She found some makeshift living quarters. Small radio, hot plate, sleeping bag, pillow, food wrappers, etc. She called the cops, who came to keep an eye on the place. They ended up catching a homeless man climbing a tree, trying to sneak into her attic window. He had been doing this almost daily. He would wait for her to go to work, then go downstairs and help himself to food and amenities. The funny part about this story is they got to know each other throughout the ordeal, and the guy was actually very respectful, just down on his luck. She didn't press charges, instead, let him move in, helped him get a job, and he lived in the attic until he got back on his feet. Creepy shit with a happy ending.
I spent my first 10 years in New Delhi. Back then, we would find dead women burnt with acid or set on fire, and it used to be so normal, like oh look, another one of those dowry cases where her family didn't pay the husband enough money so they killed her. People who use acid as a weapon are seriously fucked.
A bunch of girls in my friend group decided to have a night out and ended up at the local gay club. I can't remember why I didn't go, but I'm sort of glad I wasn't there, however I also wish I had been so I could have helped. Anyway, they noticed a girl on the dance floor who looked super out of place. She had sweatpants and a t-shirt on and wasn't wearing makeup and had her hair in a ponytail. She also had a backpack on. Basically, the exact opposite of typical club attire and not at all what someone would usually wear to this place. They said that she seemed very dazed as well, and more importantly, there was a very large man grabbing her and grinding on her and she was just kind of standing there letting it happen. Was working the evening shift at a gas station. Man comes in all disoriented. I go to help him out, he has a gash on his head and doesn't know where he was. I couldn't see any crashes around so assumed he had fallen or something. Normally we are supposed to stay inside the glass-shielded register area whenever anyone is in the store. I, being a nice human being, went to help while calling the police, EMS. They got there and checked him out. They thought his head may have been fractured. Took him to the ER. I went back to work. Cops stopped back by for some coffee a few hours later. They told me the guy got hit by a baseball bat trying to break into a little girl's bedroom and was wanted for rape and murder in 2 other states. I never left the register area at night again.
Well, I'm a bit late, and I'm not sure if anyone posted this already, but the story of Hisashi Ouchi. He suffered radiation exposure so thorough his DNA was destroyed and he probably would have died in a matter of days or even hours, but doctors kept him alive for almost 3 months. He was conscious and begging for death as his body literally fell apart. Shit that was traumatizing to watch.
Ed Kemper murdered college women because his mother worked at a college and he claims he wanted to destroy everything she loved. Check out Mindhunter on Netflix for a super creepy portrayal of Ed Kemper. That actor gives me chills and an impending sense of dread when he is on the screen.
In my town in the early 90s there was a notorious killer that had all of BC, Canada on watch. My wife's mother, years and years before I knew them, had been home alone while her husband was in England doing tree surgeon work, arborist. My family has a similar story, and I'm pretty sure some of you serial killer buffs out there might figure out who it is before the reveal because their story is pretty unique. Holy shit, this is horrifying. What a smart woman.
I made the mistake of reading about the Anthill Kids cult at night. I don't recommend it. Here's the article one read, https://www.cvltnation.com, Anthill Kids break legs sledgehammer go hell. Don't read it while you're eating.
A headless, limbless torso was found in the bushes at the rest stop in the town where I grew up. They never found the rest of her body parts or the murderer. She wasn't even identified until about a decade later. She was a prostitute that had been estranged from her family.
I once heard a property was abandoned, and it was all over school that it was haunted. My friends and I decided to drive up to take a look at it one night. It sat on a few dozen acres. There was no fence and no signs prohibiting access, and all we had to do was take a dirt road for a mile to get to a hill that overlooked the whole property. My brother-in-law is a deranged heroin addict, has been for over a decade. In 2016 he murdered my father-in-law. He attacked him from behind and crushed his head, back, shoulders with a hammer over 50 times. My husband and I were out of town and he used my father-in-law's phone to text us throughout our trip. He lived with my father-in-law's dead decomposing body for over 5 days and proceeded to steal his father's belongings and pawn them, drain his bank accounts and stole his car. When we got home he fled and sent my husband a text from his dad's phone saying he wasn't feeling well and was in the bathroom. That's when my husband found the body. He's in jail now serving 24 years, but it still haunts me.
100% true, as it happened to me. It's probably more spooky than scary. I'll let you be the judge. I am almost 2 hours deep on this thread and this is one of my favorite submissions. Crazy how the world works. I don't know much about pagers, old enough to remember them but never used them, but did you really receive the page at all? What if it was all a glitch?
My friend tripped and fell onto the tracks, landing his face onto the third rail. We kinda stood there in absolute shock because we thought he was dead, but then he said, "Can I move? Will I be electrocuted?" We told him to move instantly and he did. We got him off the tracks, and no less than 2 minutes later a train went zipping by. I think the third rail turned on seconds after his face came off of it. I know that's not scary to a lot of people, but to me it was because I would have lost a close friend back when I was about 12. A guy named Jim Mackey lives near where I work had his face burned off by the third rail. He later got a face transplant. I'll never forget seeing him come into my store. I try to be polite and treat all customers equal, but I literally froze when I saw him. I felt horrible and went out back and cried a little after that. Pics.
My mom went to school with a guy who raped and murdered a few girls in her town. When they finally caught the guy, they found a list he had made of his targets. My mom was next on the list. Old janitor from high school, friendly Ecuadorian man who went by Ping. Similar story here. I worked at Office Depot as a tech manager for a few years. One guy who lived in the neighborhood came almost every day to buy CD sleeves for his bootleg DVDs, which he was selling on the side. He was cool. Came in, chatted a bit, sometimes did some stuff at the print center, paid for his stuff and left.
Not as scary as some of the stories here, but I was pretty horrified when my dad told me the story.
The vampire rapist. He abducted, raped, and murdered multiple women. He got caught when one of the women escaped from his house after she was abducted off the road and woke up, naked, tied to his kitchen table. He was filming her, raped her, and here's the bizarre part, drained her blood and drank it. Repeatedly. She escaped from his bathroom window, still naked, and ran to the road where she was picked up and taken to the hospital. Miraculously, she lived. There's a lot of interesting detail in the story, so I highly recommend reading more about it yourself. To me, it's the most terrifying situation I can possibly imagine.
This happened about 9 years ago and isn't as interesting or dark as most of the comments on here, but hey ho. I've posted this before on another account, but I'll do it again anyway. Bear with me on it.
3 sailors survived the sinking of the USS West Virginia at Pearl Harbor, only to die 16 days later, due to the lack of air. The Navy knew they were there, but couldn't get to them. Harrison Okene 2013 Nigerian boat sinking. Was trapped in the boat for 3 days at the bottom of the ocean. The case of Elizabeth Smart. She was kidnapped, repeatedly raped, psychologically tortured, and then brought around in plain sight in heavy religious garb. She had brushes with people who could have helped her, but her kidnapper claimed she wasn't allowed to speak in public or reveal her face for religious reasons. What pisses me off about this story is the fact that Wanda Barzee is out of jail as we speak and is on probation. She should be in prison for the rest of her life just like the kidnapper. Elizabeth even said she was the most evil woman she has ever met. There are drug dealers spending more jail time than Wanda. I worked for U-Haul when I was 18 and it was located in front of a club that was known for being really sketchy. I came in to open one morning and it was common for people to knock on the door hoping to get in early and get their truck. What a nightmare. I'm glad you could help.
Years ago when I was 8, my family lived in this big weird house kind of on the edge of a small town. The school district was in the middle of a big restructuring, so even though we were only a couple grades apart, my brother and I went to different schools and took different buses. This left me as the last person to leave in the morning and the first person to get home in the afternoon, which meant it was my job to make sure all the lights were off and the door was locked. One morning I noticed the basement door was open and the light was on, so before I left I turned off the light and closed the door. When I got home that afternoon the light was on and the door was open again. I just assumed that I'd forgotten to actually take care of it when I noticed it in the morning, so I went over to turn off the light and close the door. When I got to the top of the basement stairs I looked and there was a big shadowy male figure towards the bottom of the staircase. I freaked out, slammed the door and pushed a bunch of boxes against it and then went and hid in my closet. For months I didn't tell my family because I was positive what I had seen was a ghost and didn't think anyone would believe me. Then about a year after that incident my mum and her boyfriend realized that small amounts of money had been going missing for months, totaling around $800 minus $900, but never more than $60 at once. So we all walked around the house with flashlights trying to figure out how they could have gotten in. Turns out some creep was climbing in through a small hole in the outside of the house, shimmying through a crawl space, then coming up into the house through the basement. Realizing I had been alone in the house with him on at least one occasion was one of the worst, most terrifying moments I've ever had. Edit, whoa, this blew up way more than I expected. I'm doing my best to respond to comments, questions, sorry if I end up missing yours. Home invasion is seriously one of the scariest things that can happen to a person. The home is like a final refuge from the world, and to have it violated like that is so unnerving.
I've posted this before, but mine, when I was a baby, my dad played on a softball team. Typical social team, out for beers and pizza after with the guys, family event type thing. My parents were good friends with 2 of the other couples, both of them had young kids as well.
Various torture murders are probably the most horrific things I've read about. Sylvia Likens, I got sick just reading the name again. I was thinking of adding it here but couldn't remember the last name. It was almost a relief after decades of this story sticking with me, and there was no way I could make myself go and look it up. Read it here and instantly I am sick. The driver one of the semis we took in on trade died in the truck. The sleeping area is a bunk with a mattress that can be flipped up and under it is a seat and a table. So during the day it's a dinette set up. And at night, you pull a lever and pull the bunk down to sleep. Well, something happened and the bunk flipped up while the driver was sleeping and it pinned him against the wall. He couldn't get it to drop back down and suffocated. He was stuck there for somewhere around 12 hours. Someone had noticed that he was parked for an unusually long amount of time for the kind of deliveries he did. The company that built the sleeper did something to the bunk so that couldn't happen again and supposedly recalled all of that sleeper style. In 1972, a Uruguayan plane carrying a college rugby team fell in the Andes mountain range. Of 50 people, 13 people died in the crash or the following hours, and by the next day the survivor count was down to 27, which with little food had to resort to eating the bodies of the dead, rationing how much each ate. After that, the remaining survivors made a pact stating that if they died they would be the next in line for consumption, and that the only bodies that would be used would be the families of those who voluntarily accepted to. This may just horrify me more than others. https://www.nydailynews.com, News, National, Man Found Cooked Death Tuna Factory Article 1. 1,182,607. Dude was working on a tuna steamer and they closed him in and steamed him. I can't help but imagine that as anything but a truly terrifying and painful way to die. One of the main reasons I never could bring myself to do real factory labor is because I don't trust people enough to not tuna steam me. Edit, thanks for the gold. Rip Jose Melina. It's insane how little I see maintenance using proper lockout-tagout procedure.
I'll tell you one that happened to me, or rather, I was witness to. This is probably the thing that freaks me out the most. The entire randomness of it, and yet it is fairly common. I work as a firefighter and have seen plenty of drunk driver-caused deaths. Rarely, I have a quick mini-freak in my head while I'm driving. But then I convince myself it probably won't happen to me. I think what's more scary than this, is that stories like this are a dime a dozen. 80-year-old dude at my grandfather's church went swimming when he was a kid in an old mining quarry with his cousin. They were both kids like 7 to 10. Long story short, some mine or air bubble down below the water opened up and swallowed the cousin. He had to walk back home and tell his family. They got a search and rescue down there and could never find the boy.